It was an extraordinary novelty to them, for it was recognizable that this is true talk, for it is known that on a map all things are depicted. So they understood that his words are true, since such things cannot be thought up, because one can see for himself that he can put together two ruts of the hand, and from them it will become a letter. For this reason they understood this is no contrivance. Thus it was an extraordinary novelty to them. And they asked him, "Where is the king? Perhaps he will show us a way how to find money." He answered them with an expression of someone who is awestruck and angered, "You still want money? Don't talk about money at all." They asked him, "Nonetheless, tell us where the king is." He answered them, "I too do not know the king, where he is." And this is how the story happened. Once there was a king and a queen, and they had an only daughter. And it came near the time to marry her off, so they seated advisors to give counsel as to whom she ought to be married. I too was there among the advisors, the prayer leader who is still relating this in front of them, because the king liked me, and my advice was that they should give her the warrior, because the warrior had wrought us many benefits, for he had conquered many countries. Therefore he ought to be given the queen's daughter for a wife. My advice was very well received, and they all agreed upon it, and there was a big celebration there for having found a groom for the queen's daughter. And they wed the queen's daughter with the warrior, and the queen's daughter had a child, and the baby was quite an extraordinary beauty, which was no sort of human beauty whatsoever. His hair was golden, and had all the colors. His face was like the sun, and his eyes were like other luminaries. And the child was born with mature wisdom, because they saw in him immediately when he was born that he is already a great sage. For when people were talking in the place when one needs to laugh, he would laugh. And so with other such things, they recognized in him that he is a great sage, except he did not yet have the motions of an adult, that is, he still could not talk with other such faculties. But this they saw right away, that he is already a big genius. And by the king was orator, that is, a speaker who is a master of language and rhetoric, who was able to talk very eloquently, very fine expressions, songs and praises for the king. And the orator was on his own account a fine orator too. But the king showed him the hidden path and the way for him to go up and get the power of the science of rhetoric, and thereby he became a very amazing, superb orator. The king also had a sage, and the sage was also a sage on his own account, but the king showed him the way for him to go up and get wisdom, and thereby he became an extraordinary, superb sage. And similarly, the warrior was mighty on his own, but the king showed him the way for him to go and get strength, and thereby he became an extraordinary, superb warrior. For there is a sword that hangs in the air, and the sword has three powers. When the sword is lifted, then all the officers of the opposing army flee, so as a matter of course they fall, because when the officers flee, there is no one to lead the battle, so they certainly fall. But despite this, the survivors may still be able to wage war. However, the sword has two sharp edges, and they have two powers. Through one edge they fall down, and through the other edge they get the sickness called dar, or wasting, or consumption. Namely, the enemies whom they are fighting become meager, gaunt, and lifeless. As is known of this sickness, the merciful one spare us. So, by merely making a move with the sword in its place, the enemies are stricken with the aforementioned things. That is, by using one edge, the enemies have defeat, and by using the other edge, the enemies are stricken with dar, as mentioned. And the king showed the warrior the path that there is to the sword, and from there he attained his great strength. And to me, the king also showed the way to get my specialty. I got from there what I needed. In other words, the prayer leader who was telling all this said that the king showed him the way from which to get his thing, namely prayer. And likewise, the king had a faithful friend, Ohev Ne'eman, in other words, a good friend, a good trusty friend, who was in love with the king, who loved himself with the king, who loved the king with a very extraordinary love. They loved each other so much that it was impossible for them to be one without seeing the other for some amount of time. But, nonetheless, there must be times when they need to be apart. So they had portraits in which both their images were depicted. They would delight themselves, in other words, take pleasure and satisfaction with the portraits when they could not see each other. And the images depicted how the king and his faithful friend love each other and hug and kiss each other with great love. And the portraits had the special ability that whoever looked at the images attained great love. In other words, one received the trait of love when looking at the images, and the faithful friend also received the love from the place which the king showed him. A time came when they all went, each one to his place, to receive his power there for his thing. That is, the orator and the warrior and all the king's people, each went up to his place to renew his power. And the day came to pass, there was a very big storm wind upon the world, and the storm wind mixed up the entire world and overturned the sea to dry land, and the dry land to sea, and the wilderness to settled area, and settled area to wilderness. So it overturned the entire world. And the storm wind went into the king's chamber and did nothing at all there. In other words, there at the king's, it wrought absolutely no damage, except that the storm wind went in and snatched away the aforementioned child of the queen's daughter. And amidst the commotion, as soon as the storm wind snatched away the dear child, the princess followed immediately. In other words, the princess immediately began to run after the child in order to snatch him back. She too went off someplace, no one knows where. So too the queen, and so too the king, and they all went after the child until they all became dispersed, and no one knows where they are. And all of us were nowhere nearby during this, for we were gone away then, each to his place to renew his power, as mentioned. And when we came back, we could no longer find them all, as mentioned. The hand, too, became missing then.